so pleased to welcome Anne Fadiman, author and professor of creative writing at Yale University. She's also the writer in residence. She was a longtime editor of the American Scholar and a fellow of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, as well as a member of BLR's advisory board. But in 2015, she was a judge for the BLR Literary Prizes, way back then. So tonight we're here to talk about two of Anne's many books, The Spirit Catches You and You Fall Down, and Ex Libris, Confessions of a Common Reader, two of really books that have really stayed with me, and I highly recommend them. So now many people in our audience tonight have actually read The Spirit Catches You, maybe as part of their medical school curriculum or in college. But I think very few people know kind of how the book came to be. They know it as an icon, an award-winning book, but I wonder if you could set the stage for us, Anne, and tell us kind of how you stumbled upon the story of the Lee family.
Stumbling is exactly the right word, Danielle. I had been working for Life magazine for a number of years, but had always dreamed of writing for the New Yorker. So one year I spent my entire 5-week vacation coming up with several pitches for the editor of the New Yorker, Bob Gottlieb, and a couple of days before I sent them in, I happened to be on the phone with an old friend of mine who was the chief resident in family medicine at the county hospital in Merced, California, a little city in the Central Valley of California. And he started telling me about the fascinating but extremely challenging patients, the Hmong, who had started to come into his hospital. And I didn't know how to pronounce the word. I knew absolutely nothing about the Hmong. This was before the internet, so I had no way of learning quickly about them. I wrote a pitch full of errors, was sure that this would not be the one that would be chosen. Fortunately, the editor of the New Yorker knew even less about the Hmong than I did. He picked that one, and I remember leaving his office and thinking, oh, shit, these are these patients that supposedly, nobody can understand, and they're hostile to their doctors, and nobody can communicate with them. And now I have to write about them. But I went that day and I quit my job at Life and to write a freelance article that might or might not be accepted, and flew out, and my life entirely changed.
Wow.
So stumbling, just to come back to that gerund, is exactly the right word.
Well, then maybe we could start with a short reading from the opening of the book that will kind of set the stage for the book and the whole story.
Wonderful. So I'm going to read 2 short passages about birth in Laos and the United States. If Leah Lee had been born in the highlands of northwest Laos, where her parents and 12 of her brothers and sisters were born, her mother would have squatted on the floor of the house that her father had built from axe-hewn planks thatched with bamboo and grass. The floor was dirt, but it was clean. Her mother, Fua, sprinkled it regularly with water to keep the dust down and swept it every morning and evening with a broom she had made of grass and bark. She used a bamboo dustpan, which she had also made herself, to collect the feces of the children who were too young to defecate outside, and emptied its contents in the forest. Even if Fua had been a less fastidious housekeeper, her newborn babies wouldn't have gotten dirty, since she never let them actually touch the floor. She remains proud to this day that she delivered each of them into her own hands, reaching between her legs to ease out the head and then letting the rest of the body slip out onto her bent forearms. No birth attendant was present, though if her throat became dry during labor, her husband, now Cow, was permitted to bring her a cup of hot water as long as he averted his eyes from her body. Because Fua believed that moaning or screaming would thwart the birth, she labored in silence, with the exception of an occasional prayer to her ancestors. She was so quiet that although most of her babies were born at night, her elder children slept undisturbed on a communal bamboo pallet a few feet away and woke only when they heard the cry of their new brother or sister. And the next passage is from a few pages later. When Leah was born at 7:09 p.m. on July 19th, 1982, Fua was lying on her back on a steel table, her body covered with sterile drapes, her genital area painted with a brown betadine solution, with a high wattage lamp trained on her perineum. There were no family members in the room. Gary Thusen, a family practice resident who did the delivery, noted in the chart that in order to speed the labor, he had artificially ruptured Fua's amniotic sac by poking it with a foot-long plastic amni hook, that no anesthesia was used, that no episiotomy was necessary, and that after the birth, Fua received a standard intravenous dose of Pitocin to constrict her uterus. Dr. Thusen also noted that Leah was a healthy infant whose weight, 8 pounds, 7 ounces, and condition were appropriate for gestational age, an estimate he based on observation alone, since Fua had received no prenatal care, was not certain how long she had been pregnant, and could not have told Dr. Thusen, even if she had known. Fua thinks that Leah was her largest baby, although she isn't sure, since none of her 13 elder children were weighed at birth. When she was 6 minutes old, Leah's color was described as pink and her activity as crying.
That's fabulous. And I think that you probably use a lot of interpreters along the way, in this project. But I think there are many interpreters out there, right? There are doctors and nurses. We're interpreters of the medical knowledge for the public, for our patients. Writers, journalists are interpreters of information for the public. And then there are interpreters we use for language and also for culture. So maybe you could speak a little bit about what interpreters were like for you and how it changed your writing and how maybe it changed you.
Well, I needed interpreters for both of the cultures that I wrote about. I figured that I already knew about medicine. That was part of my culture. I wasn't a doctor, but I've written a few medical stories, and American medicine, that was just the center of the universe, where, of course, I was standing. Whereas Hmong culture seemed extremely distant and exotic. And all I can say is that over the years, when I was writing this book, which took me almost 9 years, Hmong culture became more and more familiar, and medical culture became more and more strange. And I no longer felt that either medical culture or I was anywhere near the center of the universe. So I started off, of course, thinking that I needed interpreters for the Hmong language, which I did, but I didn't realize that the lack of communication between Hmong patients and their doctors at this little county hospital went far beyond the mere interpretation of words. And I started out with some high status, middle-aged male interpreters who had learned English while working for the CIA during the war in Laos. And so their bomb and gun vocabulary was quite extensive, but their medical vocabulary, not so much. And I'd hoped that they might raise my status. This was a young woman at the time. I think I'd read in National Geographic that the Hmong had a patriarchal culture. When I say that I knew nothing about the Hmong, that was actually true, but I truly knew only what I had read in National Geographic and the Encyclopedia Britannica when I first arrived in Merced. They weren't very helpful. I would ask a question. I would go into a Hmong house. I was trying to find a case. I would ask a question or direct it to the father in the family. Have you been satisfied with your medical care? And there would be a very, very long answer. And then I would turn to my interpreter and say, what did he say? And the interpreter would say, he says, no. So a lot was being communicated, but none was filtering down to me. So I ended up with an extremely young, I believe when I first met her, a 20-year-old secretary from the local refugee agency who has since gone on to get her doctorate. She is a nurse and social worker and teaches in the Central Valley now. Her name was Meiying Zhongli, and she really changed my life. I also needed to have medical language interpreted. I started reading Leah's chart, and even though I could occasionally read the words, which were scrawled semi-legibly by her doctors and nurses, But I had no idea what they meant. And also, I had no idea what the emotion was behind those words. So I sat for hours and hours and hours on the sofa of my college friend, Bill, the chief resident in family medicine at the county hospital with whom I stayed for months and months and months. And he interpreted medical culture. Thank God he didn't charge.
That's so fascinating. And it really is like it's a whole lingua franca, both of them. Now, you came into the situation as a journalist, but you became far more enmeshed in the Lee family than you might have expected. And you're still in touch with them.
Oh, yes.
And I'm wondering if your journalistic sense of objectivity shifted at all during this process.
I had no intention of being objective. It became clear early on that the Lees and I were going to become very, very close. So my goals were to be accurate and to be fair. But the reason I included myself as a minor character in the book, which hadn't been my original intention, was to declare my subjectivity. The book is all about how reality looks different depending on where you're standing. So I felt I needed to make clear where I was standing, both in the world, my own background, but also in relation to the Lees. So my views of them were and are completely subjective, but I hope fair and accurate. I like to think that my husband would have proposed marriage, even if Fua had not dressed me up as a Hmong bride and pushed me out in the living room because she was so appalled that I had reached my mid-30s without getting married. I'd like to think he would have, but you never know. He did propose the very next week. We've been together for 5 years. So, and yes, I am still very close to the Lees. In the summer of 23, 9 members of the family visited us. We live in Massachusetts, and they spent 3 days. It started with a 3 and then grew to 6 and then grew to 9, and they slept on the floor, and they were just the best guests absolutely ever. So I know children and grandchildren by this point. They will be part of my life forever, I hope.
Wow, it's quite a story. And this book was published in 1997, which is more than 25 years ago. But it continues to resonate and be assigned in colleges and medical schools. In fact, just last month, there was an article in the Boston Globe about it. And the writer was talking about his scorn of faith healing and alternative medicine. Then he read your book, which he called a, quote, modern classic. He said, all it took was one book to help him think differently. Quote, Fadiman didn't change my mind with an argument about truth of spiritual explanations. Instead, she showed me what happens when you insist that truth is all that matters. Now, of course, journalism is indeed about truth. And how do you square that?
Well, it depends how you define truth. And I do believe that accuracy is important, and I would never pretend, for example, to believe in animism or to share the beliefs of the Lee family that animal sacrifices might return Leah's soul to her body. Nor would I ever pretend to believe that the reason she had a seizure disorder is that her soul had left her body. So I believe in rational science, but I also believe in human truth. And I saw Leah's doctors using the rather limited definitions of truth that they had learned as extremely good medical students, before which they were both Phi Beta Kappa graduates of Berkeley. But they did not get along with Lees or understand them because they felt that every problem needed to be solved through logic and rationality instead of through human warmth. I saw a far less well-educated but brilliantly warm social worker with the Lees, and saw how even the way her body related to their bodies, instead of sitting or standing with perfect posture like her very tall athletic doctors, their social worker, Janine Hill, would sit cross-legged on the floor with them. She laughed a lot. She took Leah in her arms. She obviously adored Leah. Her affection for the family rather than her discomfort for the family, which is what Leah's pediatricians felt, was obvious. This to me was another kind of truth. And I saw why Neil and Peggy failed, and I saw why Janine succeeded, and realized that I myself was much more similar to Neil and Peggy, and therefore that I had a great deal to learn from the Lees, which I had definitely not learned at Harvard.
Well, and I'm curious if you see any trend in doctors and medical students and nurses today. Has that changed at all?
I think it has. The issues are all still there, but when I was first starting to report this book, there it was the and when I was writing about, it was sort of the beginnings of narrative medicine. It was the beginnings of required classes in med school, in which you actually had to think about how you related emotionally to your patients. I was a fellow at Stanford in 91, 92, a journalism fellow, and I got to audit the very first time a course was taught called The Psychosocial Aspects of Medicine. And around that time, the famous course was taught at Harvard Medical School called Patient Doctor One. And it was not called Doctor Patient One. The patient came before the doctor. And so all of a sudden, it was realized that better outcomes were produced if you actually could relate well to your patients rather than simply having learned all of the facts that would allow you to diagnose them correctly and advise the right treatment. So I was sort of part of that zeitgeist, I guess, although I didn't know it. I had never heard the phrase culture of medicine, for example, when I started this project in 1988. So I do think that the way medicine has taught has been changed, the way anatomy is taught now, respect for the cadaver, maybe writing poetry, journals, a memorial service at the end of the semester. All of this changed just during that period. And I have a daughter who is a first-year resident in internal medicine. So, of course, while she has been going through medical school, I've been absolutely fascinated to see this world through her eyes and see how much it's changed. Not that that doesn't mean it doesn't mean that it doesn't have a long way to go.
That is very, very true. The Globe author went on to say, I finished the book uncertain where she stood on Hmong spirituality. So I'm curious, where do you stand?
Well, I don't believe in it at all. However, I believe very strongly that it's enormously helpful for those who believe it. And I also saw the difference in how the Lees felt when they took their daughter, Leah, with very serious seizure disorder, to the hospital, which was an alien and scary environment, and where they were dealt with often brusquely and briefly. And the difference between that and when a tsining, a shaman, would come to their home, someone who was a member of their own clan, who knew them extremely well, who would shower attention and loving kindness on them for an entire day. That loving kindness, of course, and the animal sacrifices that came along with it were not going to cure Leah's seizure disorder. But all of us who believe in, well, let us say the title of the Stanford course, the psychosocial aspects of medicine. If we believe, for example, that there really is a placebo effect, I would say that a day-long visit from a shaman might have a very large placebo effect. The Lees felt completely cared for. So it wasn't that I believed the shaman's beliefs. It was that I believed in how the shaman related to the family, and I felt that the doctors could learn a great deal from the shaman about how to deal warmly with their patients. So that is very different from sharing the actual spiritual beliefs of the Lees and their shamans.
And how did you, as Leah grew sicker, How did you feel as you observed that?
She was already in a vegetative state when I met her, and she had been for about a year. So at first, when I heard about her case, I thought, that can't be the case I write about, because I was accustomed to writing about things that I could observe while they were happening. She was in a vegetative state, and I thought, I will never be able to reconstruct with perfect accuracy the important crisis scenes, because I wasn't there. But her chart was so extensive, thousands of pages, and it was all recent enough that her doctors and nurses, and of course her family, remembered so well that I felt I would be able to reconstruct it. But I did not see her decline. I also think that if I had arrived earlier, I would have felt I had to intervene. I would have felt would have to explain the doctors to the Lees and explain the Lees to the doctors, and thinking that maybe I could make things better. And that would have been very problematic, probably. Also, it's very hard to have a useful conversation with someone in the midst of a crisis. And I would say that the state of being in the Lee home when I first met Leah's parents was one of chronic grief. And that's not an enviable condition. I wouldn't wish it on anyone, but you can have a conversation that makes sense when you are grieving. You can't have one in the middle of an emergency. So I think just by chance, I arrived at the perfect time.
Wow. Wow. As editors, we love to talk about the craft of writing. So we have a couple of craft questions for you. And, novelists love character development. They relish it. It's their bread and butter. Now, how does a nonfiction writer approach character development for real people? Right? You want to strive for literary richness without sacrificing, truth and being accurate and being respectful.
Well, I'm not sure that I thought of the people in the book as characters to be manipulated the way I might manipulate characters if I were a fiction writer. I thought of them as gifts from reality. I was once asked what metaphor I would associate with my writing process, and I decided that I was a stone wall builder. That is, I'm pretty good at recognizing the right stones and putting them together, and I'm willing to lift really heavy ones. But I could never make the stones, so I could never be a fiction writer. So what I was trying to do from the thousands of pages of transcripts that I had, find the best quotations, find the scenes that told the story best. But I felt that Fua and Naokao and Neil and Peggy, and even Leah in her vegetative state, revealed themselves to me rather than me either creating their characterizations or brilliantly discovering them. They simply were the marvelous individuals that they are. And once I had recognized their essential traits, my only job was, how do I pick the right things, the right quotes, the right scenes, the right details in order to make them seem real to my readers?
In terms of what you choose to keep in or leave out, I mean, you have all these cassette tapes under your desk, and
yes.
Hundreds and thousands of hours, especially when it comes to sensitive personal information, medical information that maybe someone doesn't want on the page, or you think maybe they don't want.
Well, they told me these things. So the passage that I read about how Fua had given birth in Laos, she acted out for me on her living room floor. She got down on her back. She lifted her legs. She put her hands between her knees. She said, "This is how I would guide the head out." So there were things that American women might find too intimate, but Fua certainly did not. This was all pre-HIPAA, so I could never have done this book now. So I wrote, Anne Fadiman may read and use anything from my daughter's medical records. And then I had my interpreter interpret it. And then Fua, who couldn't read or write, but sort of vaguely knew the letters of her name, wrote something that vaguely approximated Fu Yang, and tore it out of my little loose leaf notebook, and I brought it into the hospital, and they said, "Okay, here's the key to the record room.
Right.
You can't use it during the day because we're too busy. But yeah, you were a friend of Bill Selvage, chief resident. Bill's a great guy. Yeah, here's the key. Just use it whenever you want." I could have accessed any patient records in the entire hospital. Honor system using the Xerox machine, a penny a page, and I went in every night. So suffice it to say that the system has changed. But the agenda that Leah's parents had was very clear. They felt that they had not been understood and that their daughter had not been well treated. And they said, "We want you to tell our story from our point of view so that other American doctors will be better doctors with Hmong children." And I interpreted that more loosely to sort of say, okay, to try to make cross-cultural communication in medicine work a little better. And therefore, they wanted those difficult details in, and the agenda of Leah's doctors was very similar. And therefore, they too gave me carte blanche and would often point out to me, they said, "Oh God, I really screwed up there. Look at that." I would have no idea what that line in the chart meant. But the chart itself was narrative medicine. For those of you who are older physicians, you remember what charts were like before they were computerized. There was nothing to check off. You wrote entire paragraphs. The doctors would remember from the speed of their handwriting how stressed they were. And they would point out all the points at which they felt they had made mistakes, because they too wanted to be helpful. And I was so lucky that the agendas of both sides so closely matched my own.
Most novels and books, we need a good guy and a bad guy, but you really didn't have any bad guys here.
No bad guys, except there were a couple of xenophobic minor characters.
But the
main characters, yes, no villains, only heroes, only really smart, good, well-intentioned, principled people who made mistakes on both sides because each side didn't understand the other. So it became clear to me early on. I very much romanticized the Lees because I thought they had less power in the relationship. I started to think that wasn't really true. Here were these brilliant doctors who were beloved by most of their patients and who had moved to Merced because of altruistic motives to serve the underserved. And the Lees had essentially brought them to their knees by being what in those days was called non-compliant. The fact that they actually had to go to the California court system and remove Leah from her family and put her in foster care for a year because they didn't know how to convince Leah's parents to give her her meds, I realized, no, really, the Lees are the ones who have the power. Except, of course, when the court system then stepped in and said, and we have even more power. I realized also that the Lees were not fair to their doctors. They did not understand how well-intentioned and careful Neil and Peggy were, how they would stay up late at night, this smart married pair of pediatricians, and say, what the hell can we do about Leah? How can we make this case work? They cared so much. And Leah's parents did not know that. So it took me years to understand that the difficulties were created by narrow thinking on both sides and not just one.
Do you think they ever grew to understand the point of view of the physicians?
Not before I met them. But there was one extraordinary moment, which I talk about in an epilogue that I wrote 15 years after the book was published. So if anybody who has an early edition hasn't read that, but I was asked to speak at UC Davis. And I happened to know that one of the Lee's daughters was a student at UC Davis. The people who asked me had no idea. I said, because I really wanted to spent time with all my friends from the book, and I said, well, how about a panel? What if you bring in Neil and Peggy, and if you bring in Lee's daughter, and what if we're all in a panel together? And what if you get a really good interpreter, and Now Kao and Fua can sit there and they can hear everybody? And they said, okay, that sounds great. And also my interpreter, Mei Ying. I said, bring Mei Ying. So it was 5 of us on the panel, and it was just it was a wonderful experience for me. But Fua and Now Kao got to hear Neil's voice break as he talked about how he had felt when he first saw Leah after she came back from the ICU in Fresno, where she had been sent. And he saw her in a vegetative state, this incredibly lively little child, and how he felt he had failed, and how he felt terrible, and how much he had loved Leah. And that was the moment when Now Kao truly understood that Leah's doctors had wanted the best for her.
That is a beautiful transition point, because we can talk all night, but I do want to talk about our second book, which is Ex Libris. This is a fabulous book for anyone who loves books, and I think lots of us secretly judge people by what's on their bookshelf, right? We look in there, but not many of us have a marriage hanging in the balance based on the books on those shelves. So I wonder if you could open by reading the opening essay. We can get a sense of your marriage hanging in the literary balance.
So this is the opening of an essay called Marrying Libraries. A few months ago, my husband and I decided to mix our books together. We had known each other for 10 years, lived together for 6, been married for 5. Our mismatched coffee mugs cohabited amicably. We wore each other's t-shirts and in a pinch socks, and our record collections had long ago married without incident, my Josquin des Prés motets cozying up to George's Worst of Jefferson Airplane, to the enrichment, we believed, of both. But our libraries had remained separate, mine mostly at the north end of our loft, his at the south. We agreed that it made no sense for my Billy Budd to languish 40 feet from his Moby Dick, yet neither of us had lifted a finger to bring them together. We had been married in this loft in full view of our mutually quarantined Melvilles. Promising to love each other for richer, for poorer, in sickness and in health, even promising to forsake all others, had been no problem. But it was a good thing the Book of Common Prayer didn't say anything about marrying our libraries and throwing out the duplicates. That would have been a far more solemn vow, one that would probably have caused the wedding to grind to a mortifying halt. We were both writers, and we both invested in our books the kind of emotion most people reserve for their old love letters. Sharing a bed and a future was child's play compared to sharing my copy of the complete poems of W.B. Yeats or George's copy of T.S. Eliot's selected poems. Our reluctance to conjugate our Melvilles was also fueled by some essential differences in our characters. George is a lumper. I am a splitter. His books commingled democratically, united under the all-inclusive flag of literature. Some were vertical, some horizontal, and some actually placed behind others. Mine were balkanized by nationality and subject matter. Like most people with a high tolerance for clutter, George maintains a basic trust in three-dimensional objects. If he wants something, he believes it will present itself, and therefore it usually does. I, on the other hand, believe that books, maps, scissors, and Scotch tape dispensers are all unreliable vagrants, likely to take off for parts unknown unless strictly confined to quarters. My books, therefore, have always been rigidly regimented. After 5 years of marriage and a child, George and I finally resolved that we were ready for the more profound intimacy of library consolidation. It was unclear, however, how we were to find a meeting place between his English garden approach and my French garden one. At least in the short run, I prevailed on the theory that he could find his books if they were arranged like mine, but I could never find mine if they were arranged like his. We agreed to sort by topic: history, psychology, nature, travel, and so on. Literature could be subdivided by nationality. If George found this plan excessively finicky, at least he granted that it was a damn sight better than the system some friends of ours had told us about. Some friends of theirs had rented their house for several months to an interior decorator. When they returned, they discovered that their entire library had been reorganized by color and size. Shortly thereafter, the decorator met with a fatal automobile accident. I confess that when this story was told, everyone around the dinner table concurred that justice had been served. So much for the ground rules. We ran into trouble, however, when I announced my plan to arrange English literature chronologically, but American literature alphabetically by author. My defense went like this. Our English collection spanned 6 centuries, and to shelve it chronologically would allow us to watch the broad sweep of literature unfold before our very eyes. The Victorians belonged together. Separating them would be like breaking up a family. Our American collection, on the other hand, was mostly 20th century, most of it so recent that chronological distinctions would require Talmudic hair-splitting, ergo alphabetization. George eventually caved in, but more for the sake of marital harmony than because of a true conversion. A particularly bad moment occurred while he was in the process of transferring my Shakespeare collection from one bookcase to another, and I called out, "Be sure to keep the plays in chronological order." "You mean we're going to be chronological within each author?" he gasped. "But no one even knows for sure when Shakespeare wrote his plays." "Well," I blustered, "we know he wrote Romeo and Juliet before the Tempest. I'd like to see that reflected on our shelves." And George says that was one of the few times he has seriously contemplated divorce.
So that gives you a taste of the book, and you just must get it. And of course, both your parents are writers and your brother is literary. And I hesitate to say that writing is in your genes, but you certainly were born into and married into a literary cauldron. And a couple of quotes from the book that I love. "Most children inherit their parents' physical features or political leanings. We inherited the family style sheet." And then you wrote, "We were not so much a family as a grammar cartel," which I loved. "In my family, writing a sonnet on demand was considered normal behavior." And of course, we'll hear about Fadiman U as well at university. But was there ever a possibility of any other career for Anne Fadiman? A CPA, a marketing director, or God forbid, a cardiologist? Was that at all ever in the cards?
A cardiologist would have been more likely than the other two. I have a friend who said that if you didn't go to law school, med school, or B school, at least you know which one you would have gone to if you had. And for me, it definitely would have been medical school, though I think I would have been one of those med students who had to, do my medical studies in Grenada, because I wouldn't have gotten into one here. But I've been able to do that vicariously through my daughter, who's a doctor. I probably was destined by both nature and nurture to be a writer, uh, maybe by process of elimination. There are many things I probably would have been terrible at. And in most families, deciding to be a writer would be so exciting. You would be, the glamorous black sheep of the family. Everybody would be saying, "Gosh, why don't you become a doctor?" And no, 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 I have an artistic temperament. I don't care if I don't make any money. I must be a writer. But really, for me, it was more like going into, the family used car business. So I didn't feel that I was being imaginative or iconoclastic by choosing that role, but it did have a feeling of inevitability, and it's definitely where I belonged.
Can you tell us about the grammar cartel?
Well, my family was very grammar oriented, and at least one of my children also was the doctor, in fact. they're all demon proof readers. My father, particularly, felt that English was deteriorating at a rapid rate. And I remember that in his old age, in his 90s, he decided that he might supplement his income by writing down corrections to the nightly news. And he thought that he would be able to make a lot of money by sending them in, until my mother gently counseled him that he the correcting the grammar in the nightly news, he might get just the same sort of reaction that he had gotten from proofreading corrections of typos, misspellings, and incorrect apostrophes on menus, and then handing the menu to the maître d' at the end of the meal. Of course, the menu was destroyed, and he didn't understand why the maître d' was not incredibly grateful. But yes, he left a trail of proofreading marks, through the restaurants of America for many decades.
And tell us a bit about Fadiman U.
Oh, Fadiman U. Well, some of you here might be old enough to remember a TV program called College Bowl. College Bowl, every Sunday, two teams, 4-person teams from 2 colleges would gather and answer questions of various sorts. Well, we were a 4-person team in our family, and we called ourselves Fadiman U, and we watched College Bowl together. And whomp, we didn't have a buzzer like the contestants on the actual show, but we would slap our knees. And I was probably the worst contestant. My father had everything literary covered. My brother knew a lot about science. My mother knew a great deal about politics and current events. And I was the youngest member of the family, and it was rare that I slapped my knee first, but I was still a proud member of Fadiman U, and we went on to victory almost every single week. We always felt that it was a real tragedy for American television that we were never actually invited on the show.
I'd love to talk a bit about the physicality of books. And you talk about the courtly love of books versus the carnal love of books. And in your essay, Never Do That to a Book, you said, my brother and I were taught to treat books as though they were holy relics. But then in Eternal Ink, you wrote, a pristine book is like a newly paved road with no tire marks. It's beautiful, but you can't tell who's traveled there. So tell us about your relationship to the physicality of books.
Yeah, I mean, that quote about treating books like a holy relic, that must be true. You quoted from the book, but my parents really didn't treat books like holy relics. They felt that to love a book was to handle a book. It was to write. Yes, it was to write in a book. It was to dog-ear the pages of a book. You needed to have a physical, carnal relationship with the book in order to show your love. And I respect people who belong to the courtly school, and who were shocked to see that I write in my books, and and look how messy they are, and look what I do with the edges. But my own relationship with books is very physical. So I own a Kindle, but hate it. I can't take out a pen. I can't take out different colors and mark different things in my Kindle. I can't put exclamation points. I mean, I was recently rereading Middlemarch, and I first read Middlemarch when I was 17, and I wrote many comments and instructions to the main character, Dorothea, like, come on, Dorothea, don't marry Casaubon. What about Will? And, it's just wonderful to see marginalia, my own or other people's. I feel that writing in the margins turns books into a conversation rather than a monologue.
In the chapter His, Her, you were wrestling with how language should recognize women equally to men without sounding lumpish. At the time you wrote it, you rejected the plural substitute, saying to each their own, right? It ran afoul of the grammar cartel. I'm wondering if you've changed since then.
Utterly. Yes, I recently wrote an essay on how I if not came to love, at least came to accept the singular they. First, for my students who were non-binary, it was so clear that they were neither he nor she. They were either both or neither, or fluidly between the two. And there needed to be a pronoun to describe accurately what they were. But it took me a little longer to be able to use the singular they instead of his or her. Simply in any situation in which we didn't know the gender or the gender wasn't important. I have embraced that too, less in my writing than in conversation. I've simply come to feel that our language is much too gendered, and the more we can take gender off the table, the better. So yes, I would now say to each their own. My parents
You
are both.
heard it here.
My parents are turning in their graves, but since they were both cremated,
Right.
I think it's okay.
So all of your work has been nonfiction. Do you ever dabble in poetry or fiction?
Yeah, I write bad doggerel for family birthdays and anniversaries. I tried fiction in college. There were no creative nonfiction classes offered in my college. I took 2 fiction classes. Both were useful because they taught me that I could never be a fiction writer. Again, it's like the stone wall builder, that I could recognize the beautiful stones. I could put them together in an okay sequence, but I could never make the stones. I would describe somebody's face pretty well in a short story, but then I couldn't decide what that person should do. My friend Ian Fraser once said that he had tried writing stories, and that he would write, John walked down the street. And then he would say to himself, no, we didn't. And that's exactly how I felt. I felt that reality could give me what I needed. And so I both love creative nonfiction and proved completely incapable of every other genre. So there was a useful alignment there.
Well, within nonfiction, other than The Spirit Catches You, which is a full-length reportage, everything else you've written is essay.
Well, I wrote a full-length memoir. Not essays.
Not essays, there you go. But what about the essays as a unique subdivision of nonfiction appeals to you?
Well, I sort of stumbled into the essay as I stumbled into The Spirit Catches You. I had had a couple of miscarriages after my first child, and I was 41 and having a problem pregnancy with what was probably my last egg, and was sent to bed for the pregnancy by my high-risk OB. And I've read since then, we don't really know whether bed rest during pregnancy really helps at all. But at that point, it was felt that it might. So I couldn't do any reporting, which was my genre. So what could I write in bed? It was clearly going to be either book reviews or essays, and I'd already written some book reviews, and I thought, well, essays would be something new. So I started writing essays, and thus published my first essay in my 40s. And then my son was born, and I could be vertical again, and I could have done any genre, at least any genre that I was temperamentally and cognitively capable of. But I had fallen in love with the essay. It's such a beautiful form. And also, I didn't want to travel for reporting when my children were young, and I had a shorter attention span. So the shorter length of an essay, something that I could conceive and finish relatively quickly, was perfect. And I love reading essays, so I spent many years writing them. And my third essay collection is going to be out in February.
All right, we'll look forward to that. And actually, as we read the slush pile for BLR, it's much harder to find good nonfiction than fiction, surprisingly. Even though we receive lots and lots of wonderful first-person narratives, but to create a really good essay, it's not the same as just writing what happened. And I wonder if you have any pearls on the essay that you could guide writers.
I'm trying to remember what do I teach my writing students that is useful to them. Well, they need to know what they are trying to say. So A happened and then B happened and then C happened is not the answer to the question, what are you trying to say? So I think that whether you're writing an essay or a book, you need to be able to answer that question. The spirit catches you and you fall down was not just A happened and then B happened and then C happened. It was a tragedy occurred because of miscommunication. That was what I was trying to say. And that organizing principle enabled me to choose what I wanted to put in. And when I write an essay, the same is true. So in Marrying Libraries, it was what happens when two writers who have thousands of books each decide to merge their libraries and throw out the duplicates. What does that say about their relationship? So I think the best thing to tell an essay writer is, or to ask an essay writer is, what are you trying to say? Because especially if it's a personal essay, it's self-reported and the author knows the subject extremely well, which is a problem. There's too much information. And the challenge is what to omit. And what you omit is anything that doesn't answer the question, what am I trying to say?
That's a wonderful way to put it. And just dovetailing on the libraries and your spouse, how do two writers manage to be together for 36 years and not kill each other? I mean, writers, like doctors, are very competitive and very envious. And how do you have literary orders of protection over different turfs? How do you manage?
We don't. Boy, our turfs completely overlap. We're both nonfiction writers. George also writes essays. He also writes books of literary reportage. He writes family memoirs. We've both written books about our families. We're on each other's team. And a friend of mine, a late friend named Mark O'Donnell, who was a wonderful humor writer, had an identical twin, Steve O'Donnell. And at one time, one of them was a writer for Saturday Night Live, and the other was a writer for David Letterman. And at one point, the twin, Steve O'Donnell, won an Emmy. And Mark was asked in an interview, are you jealous of Steve? And Mark said, oh, no, he won one for the team.
Right.
And that's how George and I feel. We edit each other's books. So we're so invested in them. We know each line so well. I could recite entire paragraphs of George's books that I've rewritten, and he could do the same for me. So that mutual investment means there's no jealousy. I can't imagine being married to somebody who wasn't a writer. What would we talk about at lunch?
That's wonderful advice, I think, for all relationships. We have actually a couple of questions submitted from our audience, and
Wonderful.
I'll give you this moment to start thinking of your questions. But so someone asked about a writer who's been in healthcare, who wants to pivot to writing, moving from being immersed in the medical system, and wants to begin a writing career, but with the ideas that come from having been in healthcare. What kind of advice do you give to someone?
Well, I think that it's a wonderful background. Everyone is fascinated by healthcare. Whenever I see a friend that I haven't seen for a while, the first thing they say is, have you seen The Pit? And everyone wants to know the inside scoop about doctors. And so those of you who are physicians and nurses and PAs have an inside scoop that I definitely did not have when I was writing The Spirit Catches You and You Fall Down. And you want to honor patient confidentiality, but you also want to communicate to readers what healthcare is like from your point of view, because your readers have experienced it only from the point of view of being a patient. So it seems to me that you have a uniquely fascinating perspective. It's so fortunate that you're not accountants trying to make your profession interesting. So I think if you're writing about cases, pick the ones that are most interesting. And when you are beginning to write, the best thing is to find either an interested spouse or a good friend, someone who is not a physician, and start telling them the story that you want to write about? What are they interested in? When do their eyes light up? When do they find themselves looking down at their watches? See what questions they ask of you. That's going to guide you so that you will see how to present the story most interestingly.
That's fabulous advice. And someone else asked about your writing process. Do you write drafts? You do outlines? You do the whole thing at once, particularly with Spirit? What was the process of getting this enormous story on the page?
Oh gosh, I had years of research, both reportorial research and reading for every other chapter is contextual, so long history and so on. So then I just had tens of thousands of pages of stuff. So I divided it all into folders and outlines so that when I wrote about a particular subject, I wouldn't think about all the other tens of thousands of pages. I would be thinking only about, okay, here's the footnote about Hmong music, and I'm going to look in the Hmong music folder, and I'm not going to think about anything else. I do make outlines. I don't always follow them. George does not make outlines. My writer husband often likes to begin in the middle. I always begin with the first sentence. I always feel, how could I begin a book with anything but the first paragraph? Because I need to know exactly what mood the reader is in, because the reader has just read that paragraph. How could I begin in the middle? But I know writers have very, very different ways of writing. I divide these two groups into diamond polishers like me. We're sort of little miniaturists, and we can't go on to the paragraph 2 till paragraph 1 is perfect. Swamp drivers who, they have to go fast or they might sink into the swamp. And George is a happy swamp driver who writes a zillion drafts. And when he's gotten to about draft 25, every sentence is perfect. The first draft he writes very fast in a language other than English, as far as I can tell. It doesn't really have subjects and verbs. But he just keeps writing and writing and writing and writing. Whereas my first drafts are very similar to my final drafts, though I still do write a lot of drafts.
So you had spent so much time immersed with the Lee family and this whole situation. How did that change you both as a writer and as a person?
Well, this was my first book, so of course it changed me as a writer because it made me realize that I could write something more than a magazine article. It started as a magazine article, but by the time I finished it, the editor of the New Yorker had changed and was replaced by someone extremely interested in celebrities and extremely uninterested in epileptic Hmong toddlers. And so it was not published as a magazine article, so I had to make it into a book. Yes, I learned that I was maybe almost a better marathoner than a sprinter, and that was a surprise. But I think the life lessons I learned from the Lees were far more important. And it was the dismantling of my Western rational views. My mind is the same as it always was. I still go about problem solving in the same ways I always did, but I know they're not always going to work. I am convinced that in many situations, they are not the optimal method. And so instead of making me arrogant and proud of myself because I'd actually written a book, I think that what I mainly learned was humility, because I learned how incapable I was at many things that I had imagined I knew how to do.
Are you a different kind of patient now?
Yes, I'm a very different kind of patient. Less patient probably. I insist on doctors who will treat me as a full human being and not just a body part. And when my children were young, I insisted on that for them as well. So in 2007, when I had breast cancer, boy, I interviewed a lot of people for picking my surgeon, my oncologist, and so on. I wanted to be not just a pair of breasts, one of which had a problem. I wanted to have, head, neck, heart, problematic toenails, the whole lot. I wanted to be seen fully by my doctors. I do demand that. They also have to be incredibly knowledgeable, and so they have to be fabulous doctors, and they are.
Someone asked, If you were to fast forward, the spirit catches you to this post-pandemic AI era, do you think the outcome might have been different?
Oh.
Like, are we progressing or are we retrogressing as a
I think we are progressing, but there are other reasons why the outcome would have been different that simply have to do with the course of Hmong cultural history. When Leah was first brought to the hospital in the 1980s, the Hmong had just arrived in the United States. They started coming here at the end of the Vietnam War, came in the late 70s and the early 80s, and very few Hmong adults spoke English. So now everybody of childbearing age who is Hmong and lives in the United States is bilingual and bicultural, and therefore does not need either a linguistic or a cultural interpreter, which doesn't mean that Hmong medical cases always turn out right. They don't. But the specific problems that happened with miscommunication with the Lees would not occur. Also, if I were Hmong and I came into the county hospital in Merced, I would find things very different now. And I also think that medicine is taught differently these days. People are in medical school, learn much more about cross-cultural medicine, about dealing with interpreters, about respect for other cultures. Cultural competency is now often referred to as cultural humility in ways that it definitely didn't used to be. So yes, the rise of AI, I think, is an anti-humane movement, but in general, things have been going in the right direction, though they still have a long way to go.
So for doctors today who can't spend the day like the shaman did, who have interpreters with patients who are new to the system, what advice can we give to them to make that 20 minutes or 10 minutes effective?
Don't look at a screen. Don't look at your interpreter. Look at your patient. Spend as much time looking directly at your patient and touching your patient as possible. Make contact physically and emotionally with your patient in order to gain the patient's trust. If you have only 20 minutes, you still, nonetheless, by the end of those 20 minutes, may have a very, very good idea of what that patient should do to make themselves better. However, whether that patient will actually follow your suggestions is something else. And that patient's certainty that you have fully seen them as a person is what is going to make them decide, yes, I will take that med. Yes, I will have that surgery. Yes, I will follow your advice. You seem like a good person who is truly interested in me as a human being.
And I think that advice holds even for patients who don't need an interpreter or
Yes.
no issues with English. I think for most patients, even 5 minutes of full frontal listening, as we like to call it.
That's a nice phrase. I like that.
Thank you. What's the difference between curing and healing?
Yes, I guess I am much more in favor of healing. Curing is the medical assumption that all of you physicians here have gone to medical school and done your residencies in order to fix problems. You don't cure a patient, you cure a disease. Healing, I think, is a way of looking at the entire patient. And I can imagine a patient feeling at least somewhat healed by a physician, even if the medical problem did not fully resolve. So healing also could involve all kinds of things. It could involve many ways in which lifestyle changes for the patient could help with the medical problems. It is a much broader way of seeing healthcare issues. And the notion of a physician as a healer. A healer, of course, is a term also used for shamans and other spiritual healers. And I love the idea of medical healing similarly being a kind of sacred art in which, with your eyes and your hands and your knowledge, you were able to do something really quite magical. And your technology, whatever tools you are using, you are doing something that the patient cannot do themselves.
Right, but you could say that Leah may have been healed, but she could have also possibly been cured. And the painful thing is that had she been able to take those medications in some way, she might have also been cured in addition to being healed.
It's possible, but she had, toward the very end of her life, she'd gotten a tentative diagnosis of Lennox-Gastaut syndrome, which, for those of you who are physicians know, is a very difficult to treat, intractable seizure disorder. And we're also talking about the mid-'80s. And so she stopped seizing when she entered a vegetative state after her neurological crisis. So that diagnosis was never confirmed. But if she really did have Lennox-Gastaut, I'm not sure that even if her parents had sort of kept giving her the Depkine, that it would have worked. However, we don't know. It certainly is true that in most cases where parents refuse to administer the meds ordered by the doctors, the child suffers. And therefore, what really needed to be healed wasn't just Leah, but the patient-doctor relationship. And if that relationship could have been healed, who knows what would have happened to Leah.
That is a beautiful place in which to end. I want to thank you, Anne Fadiman, for a lovely conversation.
Thank you, Danielle.